1976. A young, bullied high school girl gets to finally escape the clutches of her religious, abusive home life for one perfect night. She's being taken to the prom by one of the cutest boys in school. She and her date spend the night chatting, laughing, dancing, doing all the things you're supposed to do for this teenage rite of passage. Then, as the icing on the cake, they're voted prom queen and king. Everything seems almost too good to be true. But this perfect high school dream is about to become a nightmare. Following a cruel and brutal practical joke, this high school girl loses control of her mind and body, leaving nothing but blood, pain, suffering, and death in her wake. Join me as we continue our journey through the mind and body as we discuss Stephen King and Brian De Palma's Carrie.
I can see your dirty pillows.
Welcome back to the Evolution of Horror. My name is Mike, and as ever, I am your host. If you're tuning in for the first time, then welcome. In this podcast, we explore and dissect the history and the evolution of the horror genre by looking at particular subgenres one series at a time. We are currently in the middle of our journey through the mind and body in horror cinema, and this is part 6, in which, as that intro suggested, we are only discussing one film and one film only, one of the all-time greats, an absolute classic, Brian De Palma's Carrie from 1976. We will be talking about this film in spoilerific detail. I mean, it's impossible to discuss Carrie without discussing that ending. So if you haven't seen Carrie, what are you doing? Go and give it a watch and then come back and listen to our discussion. Quick announcement before we get started, just to say that this Sunday night, that's Sunday the 19th of July, I am going to be hosting another EOH pub quiz. For those of you who haven't done one of our online quizzes before, they're great fun. You can just watch along online. You don't need to do anything except watch along, have a pen and paper to jot down your answers. You can be part of a team or you can play individually, and I will test you on all your horror knowledge. The last couple of quizzes were so much fun. I would love to see as many of you there as possible. Rather than on Facebook, this month's quiz is going to be hosted on our new YouTube channel, EOH TV. So at 8 p.m. UK time this Sunday night, that's Sunday the 19th of July, come on over to youtube.com/evolution of horror and put your horror knowledge to the test. Okay, let's get into our Carrie discussion. Very excitingly, I've got one of my favourite people joining me to discuss this movie. He was here last series discussing John Carpenter's Prince of Darkness and In the Mouth of Madness with me, and he's back. He is the cult programmer for the BFI, and he happens to be a very, very big fan of Brian De Palma's Carrie. Welcome back to the podcast, Michael Blyth. Hello.
Hello.
Hello. How are you? How's life? How's lockdown?
I'm good. Life is fine. Lockdown's fine. It's weird.
Yeah.
I quite like working from home. So, to be honest, I'm kind of living my dream at the moment where I'm shut away from society and I'm just watching films.
It's weird, isn't it? That has been the conversation I've had with most people so far. Like, I think it's us types of people, right? People that love films, people that love horror. They're like, oh, well, it's actually not too bad.
Yeah. I'm trying to keep up the act of like, oh, it's so difficult not seeing friends and colleagues. But, I'm like, who?
Yeah, I know. And what about just what you do? I mean, the festival life and finding new films out there and new filmmakers and that kind of thing, has that kind of ground to a halt for now, or?
No, we're still full steam ahead. We're the London Film Festival, which we're working towards at the moment, which happens in October, we're doing in a slightly different form. So it'll be a kind of hybrid online and with some film screening physically in cinemas. So it's going to be a kind of different LFF, not as we know it, but we're still going ahead. So very much, the kind of same kind of run that we'll be going through at the moment, watching films, tracking stuff, research is full steam ahead.
how I would put this film in any kind of subgenre of horror, I suppose. In some ways, it stands apart from so many other things. But let me just ask you, based on what we've been talking about over the last few weeks, first of all, body horror and the idea of body horror. What are your thoughts on that area of the genre? Are you a fan?
Oh, yeah, I'm definitely a fan. I mean, I'm probably like most people. You think body horror, you think Cronenberg.
Yeah.
It's that you just can't get away from that.
Yeah.
I'm a big Cronenberg fan. So, yeah, I'm very much a body horror fan. I think I've always been into kind of gore, and I've always been into the kind of more graphic side of horror. I mean, I'm into all horror, but I've always had that kind of taste for it. I think, poring over the pages of Fangoria as a child and finding the juiciest pictures was a big pastime for me.
Do you have a favourite Cronenberg?
Actually, my favourite Cronenberg is probably moving. Well, I guess it still sits in a kind of body horror realm, but my favourite is Crash.
Oh, yeah.
Which is the ultimate Cronenberg for me. So a different kind of body horror.
It is,
but still,
it kind of is in a lot of ways. It's kind of, we talked about this a couple of weeks ago, it's kind of like it was it's almost that kind of transitional for Cronenberg, isn't it, before you get into the later Cronenberg. What do you think of kind of his later stuff from Cosmopolis, Maps of the Stars and all that stuff?
Yeah, I'm into them. I've always got time for them. I think they're hit and miss for me. Maps to the Stars was a big hit. Cosmopolis was a big miss.
Yes,
so
agreed.
I'm kind of fall somewhere in between, but I think Crash for me was the kind of the pinnacle and the kind of last truly great film that he made. Maybe History of Violence could be up there as well. But
will he ever return to full on body horror? Do you think?
I don't think
Is he
so.
done with it?
I mean, I'd kind of love him to, but I don't know. We'll see. You never know. I mean, it's just that's the fun thing with Cronenberg, isn't it? You still see those glimpses of it. You still see those moments, and it brings you back to the things that you first fell in love with him. About. But he's grown, he's changed. I guess everyone has to grow up eventually.
Exactly.
I'm resisting.
Have to grow one day. And on the flip side to that, we're also talking about the horror more that deals with the mind, I suppose, psychological horror, whatever you want to call it. For example, Repulsion, which we discussed last week, those kind of movies. How do you feel about that stuff? Again, sometimes kind of crosses over into more art house territory as well. I mean, what are your feelings towards those types of movies? Yeah,
I mean, it's funny, isn't it? Because psychological, and I think we've kind of had a conversation about this before when we were talking about like slashers v ghosts and stuff. It's like psychological horror can be a kind of go-to term for people that want to justify why they like horror films. They don't want to like a certain type of film, but a psychological film. That's classier. That's to do with your mind. So I think that's what's kind of interesting talking about Carrie today. Will be I think this idea of kind of mind and body of this series, and it's quite a kind of abstract idea. And in many ways, I think Carrie's one of the perfect films that does kind of incorporate those two things.
I think
this season could be based around Carrie. It is purely mind and body.
It's the night of the senior prom. The Bates High School gym is alive with excitement. Everybody is there, even Carrie White, the girl no one likes.
We're all sorry about this incident, Cassie.
It's Carrie!
And everyone makes fun of her.
Free, Carrie!
The girl who lives in that creepy house with her crazy mother.
Help the sinning woman see the sin of her days and ways. Show her that if she had remained sinless, the curse of blood would never have come on her.
The girl with the strange power.
If I concentrate hard enough, I can move things.
But tonight, no one will laugh at Carrie.
If you don't have a date for the prom next Friday, would you like to go with me?
She's with the best-looking boy in the senior class.
He's trying to trick me again.
She'll be voted queen of the prom.
I can make sure that you don't hurt Carrie White anymore.
For Carrie, it will be a dream come true. For everyone else, it will be a nightmare. Carrie. A new film by Brian DePalma. Based on the chilling bestseller. Starring Sissy Spacek, Piper Laurie, and introducing John Travolta in his first motion picture role. If you have a taste for terror, you have a date with Carrie.
So Carrie is about a young girl at school who's an outcast, bullied by her peers, has a similarly destructive and sad home life with an overbearing religious mother, and she has kind of dormant telekinetic powers, which gradually throughout the film come to the forth and are kind of brought about through moments of extreme anxiety or stress. And it basically all comes to a head at her senior prom when her evil classmates play a bad prank on her.
Yes, indeed. I remember, I think the very first time we ever chatted on this podcast when we were talking about slashers, and I asked you what your favourite horror film is, and it is Carrie, right? This is your fave.
My favourite horror. It's my favourite film. It's my favourite thing. It's my favourite thing that has ever existed in this world.
Oh my God, I love
Carrie.
this. This is so exciting. So first of all, to ask you a very easy question, why? Why is it your favourite film?
Actually, that's not an easy question. I think someone saying why is something your favourite is one of the hardest questions. It was the film that, I guess not to be too dramatic, it's the film that changed my life. It's the film that I was always obsessed with horror movies, of course. Carrie, I think, was the one that I saw which changed it all for me, which made me really think about horror as art, as film. I was thinking about filmmaking. I was thinking about this way that it kind of resonated with me. It went beyond the kind of thrills of horror that I was used to and hit me so much deeper. And it was a film that was really, really important to me growing up. And, I've watched, and I still watch kind of over and over again. I never tire of it. And I always find something in it new, something that speaks to me, something that I relate to. And I think it's, I can talk about why I think technically it's a great film, why I think, there's all these things about it that make it a masterpiece, but it's just the film that I've connected with like no other.
Oh, I love it. I agree with you. I absolutely love it. It would be in my maybe top 10. And I always forget every time I watch it how not only creepy it is, but heartbreaking. Absolutely heartbreaking. Like, it's one of the few horror movies that makes me almost want to cry. And I think it's because I just want to give Sissy Spacek a hug throughout the whole thing,
Yeah,
it's
absolutely.
Such a moving film as well, isn't it?
Yeah, totally. It's devastating. It's funny when people talk, when you see Carrie kind of hit lists of, the scariest films of all time and stuff, it's always something that sits weirdly with me because I've never, I rarely get scared by horror films, but it's a film that is so far away from frightening to me. I guess what's frightening about Carrie is the idea of what people do to each other, about the cruelty of teenagers, about the kind of impact of bullying, all these kind of things that are frightening about it. But the kind of horror aspect of it for me is never something that's frightening. It's
an
catharsis.
Empowering almost, isn't it? Kind of horror. Yeah, it's so true. So why don't we start by talking about Stephen King? Because this was, if I'm right in saying, one of the earliest ever kind of Stephen King adaptations, right? At least one of the first sort of big ones.
Yeah, it was the first adaptation.
Right.
It was Carrie was his first published novel.
Yes.
So I think he got paid $2,500 or something for the rights to Carrie, some insanely small amount of money.
Oh, I love it.
But obviously the film of that was hugely influential in his career. So it was a really kind of important $2,500 for him.
Yeah. Oh my God. Are you a fan of the book as well?
Yeah, very much. I do prefer the film.
Mm-hmm.
I think King himself talks about it and says that he prefers the film.
That's interesting.
I think he talks about the there was a kind of very well documented history of Carrie when Stephen King was writing it, and he talks about how he got, a third of the way through this manuscript and threw it in the trash, was like, this is rubbish, I'm not going to carry on. And his wife found it in the rubbish, fished it out, read it, encouraged him to carry on. And he was like, it's not going anywhere, I can't write about teenage girls. She was like, well, do you know what, you've got me, I can help with that side, you keep going, write this book. And it was the first book that he sold and the first book he got published. So, and Stephen King has kind of, I guess he remembers that book and he remembers it fondly, and it was very important to him, but I don't think it's necessarily a book of his that he loves. Looking back, I think, he sees that he was a fledgling writer. It was kind of, making mistakes that you might see in any of your work that you revisit when you're kind of older.
Sure.
And I think he's talked about DePalma's film having a kind of lightness to it or a deftness to it that his book doesn't have. So it's kind of interesting to hear him talk about the film so fondly and how he thinks it's an improvement on what he did.
Well, that's really interesting because, of course, famously, he has so many opinions about various film adaptations of his books, right? And I was thinking about it today, like, it does feel like some of the more successful adaptations of Stephen King books are ones that stick less rigidly, I suppose. Like if you think of, Kubrick and DePalma as well, more these filmmakers that put their own kind of real visual and stylistic stamp on the story more than kind of slavishly adhere to the book itself, I guess. That seems to happen, doesn't it, with King?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's like, the film is DePalma's Carrie. Absolutely.
Yes.
I mean, it actually doesn't stray too far from the text, in terms of the narrative, in terms of what happened. It does some stuff with the structure. It changes some of the characters, a few kind of plot details and stuff. But, it does stick quite closely, but it's very much DePalma's creation.
Yes.
And I think, what works so well about Carrie, and I think some of the things that make King difficult to translate to screen, is his books are quite complex sometimes, and I think there's something about this kind of internal language of his characters that King always goes back to. He's very much into like these constant like thoughts of his characters. Like he explains a lot of action through thought, and I think that's often quite hard to convey on film. But there's a simplicity to Carrie, the novel, which is perfect for film. It really translates. It's very, it's almost the way that DePalma plays it. And there's literally sequences in Carrie that are like a silent film.
Yes.
There's like 15-20 minute slow motion sequence that is silent filmmaking where you're just shown the things that are happening, the cycle of events.
Yes.
So I think there is that kind of simplicity to it. While I think it's complex in many ways, and there's so much richness in there, the kind of narrative and the way that it pans out has a kind of simplicity, which is perfect.
Which is perfect, which is what the best films should do, I think, right? I agree with you. There's De Palma himself feels like he does... It's his directing that does a lot of the heavy lifting, in a way, it feels like, because I think it must be a difficult thing to pull off. I mean, we're talking about Scanners in a couple of weeks, and I forgot kind of how hokey some moments of Scanners look when people are kind of telekinetically kind of fighting with each other and people doing these kind of crazy facial expressions and kind of really squinting, and all these actors doing all these things to kind of convey that they're doing something telepathically. And it feels like Brian De Palma kind of nails those sorts of effects in this movie because it's all done with camera work or with editing or with music, as opposed to Sissy Spacek, I suppose, really kind of going for it with her showing that she has these powers. Do you know what I mean? Like, it feels like the filmmaking does a lot of the work.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's really true. But also I think there's the aspect that Carrie is, because she's not in control of her powers, and I think her powers are a reaction to something that's happening to her. They come at moments of, like I was saying before, moments of extreme sadness or intense emotion. They pour out of her. Yeah. So you don't have that kind of hokey moment with people kind of staring at each other and kind of shaking and blood pouring out of their eyes. Yes. It's literally like this uncontrollable thing that flies out of her. So I think that, the way that De Palma films that, the way that De Palma frames those scenes adds to this sense of a kind of lack of control. And I think what's really interesting, because we're talking about mind and body, and, you think about Carrie as being a film that's about powers of the mind. Yes. But she's not really in control of her mind, I think, to a certain extent. It's not about her mind being this powerful thing that she uses to exact revenge. Yeah. It's like almost like her body's reaction to the events around her.
Exactly.
So it's kind of a kind of odd telekinesis in lots of ways.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think, of course, as much as the whole point of it is she can move things with her mind, it is, I think, this is really a story of Carrie's body, isn't it, to be honest? I was going to ask you anyway about the opening scene, so this seems like a good place to start, really. I mean, if anything says this is going to be a film about the body and the bodily changes, it's this opening scene, right? This moment when Carrie has her first period. It's a really kind of quite shocking scene in some ways because of the bullying that occurs here. So she has her first period, and of course she is brutally sort of mocked and attacked by the other schoolgirls who throw tampons at her. What are your thoughts on this whole sequence?
I think the stuff to do around her first period, the stuff to do around the kind of female body is very complicated. I think it's, something that's debated continuously. People fall on many different sides. Right. With De Palma, just as a filmmaker in general, you have a lot of people who accuse him that he's just a misogynist and kind of little more than that. I think, I'm a huge fan. De Palma's my favourite filmmaker. Right. I wouldn't make claims that he's not a misogynist. Yes. I wouldn't make claims that, he doesn't deal with or kind of portray women in various problematic ways throughout his films. You look at, Blowout or something with this kind of naive prostitute in over her depth, or you look at Dress to Kill and this kind of sexually adventurous,
or is it body double,
middle-aged mother? Yeah, the body double. It's this kind of porn star who's this kind of pawn in this game. There's lots of ways that he uses women, and there's lots of ways that the ways his camera kind of gazes upon women. De Palma is above and beyond anything else a voyeur.
Yes.
I think he doesn't try and hide that in his films. He's very interested in voyeurism, and he's very interested in titillation.
Yeah.
So, you know, when you combine all of these things and you put it in this story of a young girl having her traumatic first period, and, you know, this kind of awakening of these powers that she has, you know, are we talking about something that's about this kind of, I don't know, idealized vision of women that he has as his camera slowly pans through the changing rooms at the beginning, and these kind of naked young bodies are jumping around, and then this kind of vile, disgusting thing that we're presented with when Carrie has her first period. You know, is he talking about his kind of fancy of women compared to this kind of, you know, so-called awful reality? I'm using inverted commas very strongly right here. These aren't my feelings. You know, or is the film about a woman, you know, about kind of this kind of innate power of women? Is it about something to do with this kind of subjugation of women and about the kind of cruelty that women face and unleashing that? Is there a kind of wish fulfillment or a kind of catharsis in here? So I think it can fall under lots of different ways, and different people see it in different ways, and whether that be kind of feminist critics who some are pro-Carrie, some are anti-Carrie. Right. But I think there's, you know, across the board a feeling that Carrie is a very significant piece of work. Yeah. I think, you know, you can't talk about female representation in the horror film without talking about Carrie. It's such a seminal text when it comes to it. So I actually wrote down like a couple of quotes because I was thinking about this. And I was thinking, obviously, we're going to think about blood and we're going to think about menstruation. We're going to think about this kind of aspect to it. And, you know, you have someone like Barbara Creed, and she says, women's blood and pig's blood flow together, signifying horror, shame, and humiliation. So it's very much about this idea of women's bodies and kind of, you know, this idea of menstruation being humiliation, being shame, and being something kind of disgusting, being something dirty, and being something, you know, in the case of Carrie, which kind of awakens a monstrous side to her. So, you know, she goes from being young innocent to being a monster, to being a killer, whatever that means. And then you have, you know, other things like I was saying about, you know, maybe it is more about female oppression. There's something in it that's more about liberation or emancipation. And there was a article that Badisha wrote in The Guardian a couple of years ago, who's a kind of feminist commentator, and she was saying, I love this quote, she said, we, as women, we sublimate our trauma, mute our pain, internalise our anger, and try to damp down our fear, desire, and frustration. If, like Carrie, we really gave full voice and action to how we felt, then the patriarchal world would collapse. Ooh, so nice. I love this idea of, like, you can see Carrie as this attack on patriarchy. Yeah. You can see it as a woman so beaten down that all she has to do is fight back, and that fight is a destruction of all the things that we hold dear, all the ways in which the world's run. Yeah, totally. Because I do think that there's always this subtle difference sometimes, isn't there, between, you know, what a film is portraying its characters doing and what the film wants us to think about what's being portrayed, you know, is conveying something, endorsing it or whatever. I don't think that the film itself wants us to find Carrie's first period something horrific or gross. Personally, I think that what we're supposed to find horrific and gross in this scene is the bullying, is that real brutal treatment of Carrie over having her first period. Yeah, no, absolutely. It's hard, isn't it? Because it's just like, I think there is something about it that is always kind of subjective, though, when we're talking about this. I mean, it's like, I'm very aware we're two guys sitting here talking about Carrie. My experience when I was 12 years old watching Carrie, and, you know, my reaction to seeing that on screen is very different to if I'd been a 12-year-old girl watching that, perhaps. It's very different, you know, throughout my life, what that film was meant to me. Is only coming from my experience. So I think there is kind of something in there. But, you know, what is interesting about the film, and I think, you know, like I said, in many ways, DePalma is indefensible. But I think the thing that is different with Carrie, and the thing that stands out with Carrie with most of his films, is, you know, it begins with an exercise in voyeurism. It begins moving through the changing room, and then it moves on to Carrie, and then you get this sharp kind of jolt into, you know, reality, if that's what you can call it. And then we switch. We're not a voyeur anymore. We're with Carrie. We're with all the women in that film. It's very much based around the women. You know, the kind of male characters in that film are on the periphery. They're pretty much kind of pawns, rather than the women being pawns, which they quite often are in DePalma's films. The men are the pawns here. And it's about very much the exists to kind of get inside, and you live with these different women. You feel the experiences of the different women in that film.
Yeah.
And I think, there is, it's not perfect. It's not, I'm not saying this is a kind of flawless display of femininity on screen, but there is something about it which is, it's concerned with the kind of female experience in a way that DePalma, his films often aren't.
Yeah.
So I think that there's something that in doing that, in kind of moving away from a slightly more voyeuristic edge as the film goes through, Carrie is ultimately this kind of figure to empathise with and not to fear, not to be repulsed by, not to be disgusted by. You really care for Carrie at the end. It's devastating when she dies. And it's like, you can't think of many horror films that when the, supposed villain dies, that you want to cry. It's like you do with Carrie. It's really traumatic.
Yes.
So I think De Palma cares for Carrie.
More massively,
than people perhaps give him credit for.
Right, yeah, that's really interesting. So voyeurism aside, I suppose, what is it about DePalma that you love? I mean, he's your favourite filmmaker.
I don't want to interrogate that, actually.
I love it after the conversation we've just had. But no, I mean, he is an incredible filmmaker, isn't he? And I guess, for maybe people that haven't checked out some of his, other movies, how would you describe DePalma? What kind of a filmmaker is he then?
DePalma is... how would I describe De Palma? I think the first place I would go is that De Palma is a bit of a pervert. I think that's his, and that's what he is. I think he's like I said, he's a voyeur. He has his obsessions and he has these things that excite him, and he just returns to them time and time again. And I think there's something really unashamed about the way that he does that, and I think something that's so exciting the way he does that. If you kind of look at his films and you compare him, he kind of emerged in this same period as Spielberg and Scorsese and Francis Ford Coppola, and they were very much kind of gang, and they used to hang out and show each other their films and chat to each other and help each other out. And you have these filmmakers whose careers, they blossomed and they're taken so seriously. It's like people just, revere Martin Scorsese, and it's like the way that people talk about him is this kind of, great kind of classy filmmaker. And De Palma's still dismissed. I think De Palma's still the kind of like, little brother that
the black
people
sheep.
try and ignore. Kind of thing. And I think it's because his films there is something sleazy about them.
Yes, sleazy is a good word. Yeah.
Like I said, there's something so upfront about the way that he shares his passions and his obsessions. Two of his films, Passion and Obsession.
Nice.
That was I didn't even mean to do that. That was so good. So I think there's something sleazy, which means that people don't take them seriously. But actually, if you kind of step back and you look at his films as, kind of technically what they do, what he does with his camera, the way he tells stories, his kind of visual language, it's extraordinary. I think it's more exciting than Scorsese, it's more exciting than Coppola. If you watch Noah Baumbach's documentary De Palma, where he does that kind of long, it's like an hour and a half interview, and he talks through each of his films. We see clips from the films, and you see this body of work of someone with such a clear vision, such an absolute clarity of vision in what they want to do and why they want to do things. Everything is... Every moment of every De Palma film means something to him. It's like exactly what he wants it to be, or even if it's not exactly what he wants it to be, he can tell you what he did want it to be and why it didn't work. I think there's something about him. I think he's a kind of masterful filmmaker, but he's, unfortunately at the same time, just a bit of a pervy old man. So, I mean, not all his films are like that, of course. There's others, if you look at the kind of gangster films or... the war films that he make, there's different textures in there. There's different kind of storytelling, but there's also even in his kind of, again, inverted commas, like classier films, or not the ones that are less kind of B-movie. There's still a kind of a bluntness to his storytelling. There's still something that's almost verges on crass sometimes in the way that he does tell his stories, and I kind of love that about him. Again, it's like
he's not subtle, is he?
No, exactly. And we talk about Carrie, and why Carrie's so perfect for him is because Carrie is kind of simplistic in lots of ways, in terms of, like we said, the narrative arc. And I think sometimes that doesn't work for him, like when he was adapting Bonfire of the Vanities, and it was a disaster, and he kind of changed the book and reduced it to something which it very much wasn't. The kind of satire was all wrong. Everything that the original kind of source text was about, De Palma kind of lost and simplified it to a certain extent, and it just gets lost. The meaning gets lost, and it's ridiculous. Whereas if you give something to De Palma simple, he does it just perfectly. His films could be silent, like I said before. I think there's so much of his storytelling that's the way he kind of visually describes what's happening is so exciting.
It's quite an Italian thing, it feels like, too, right? I mean, we've talked about Fulci before together. There is I think especially with some of his early films like Carrie and also Dress to Kill, there is almost a kind of giallo vibe, isn't there, to how it's shot and scored?
Yeah, absolutely. It's like people always say that Argento's like the Italian Hitchcock, but he's not. He's like the Italian DePalma, or De Palma's like the American Argento. And of course De Palma's hugely influenced by Hitchcock, so there's a kind of cycle and there's a kind of pool there that we're working in, but the language, this kind of operatic violence, this kind of Baroque Grand Guignol type of atmosphere that he creates is very giallo.
And I guess it really does work for Carrie because it's, teenage stories and teenage hormones, it is big, it is operatic, it can feel like life or death, these kind of high school teen stories, even when they're not situated in the horror genre, right? And I think it really fits that kind of story and those characters.
Yeah, absolutely. In the way that he shoots Carrie, it's like the tricks that he uses in Carrie, it's like literally every single thing that he can do, he does. There's split screen, there's slow motion, there's fast motion, there's like this kind of kaleidoscopic effect.
Yes.
There's, he shoots things backwards and plays them forwards.
Yeah.
There's so much trickery in there and visual trickery in there. But what's amazing about the way that it works in Carrie is it never overshadows the emotional core of the film.
Yeah.
It's like it's style and substance, Carrie. It is literally both of those things. Mm-hmm. And like you're saying, I think you're absolutely right. There is something about the kind of heightened nature of teenage reality. There's something about the heightened cruelty of what's happening that the way that he shows this through this kind of over the top, kind of overly expressive visual language really kind of complements.
Yeah, it feels like that, doesn't it? And I guess, in some ways this is a pretty early, American teen movie too, isn't it? I mean, it's hard to imagine that they may not have really existed as much, back then. I mean, I suppose we had things like Black Christmas before this, but on the whole, there wasn't that kind of boom of sort of teen horror movies, were there yet at this point?
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, it really works as just a teen movie. I mean, the difference is, it's like, if Carrie was a more conventional teen movie, at the end of the thing, she would be announced prom queen, and then she'd give a really moving speech about how we should be kinder to each other, and then it would cut to credits. But in Carrie, she, we know what happens. She kills everyone. I know. Poor Carrie. So, so there is something in there that isn't, that far away from the teen movies you recognise now. You watch Never Been Kissed or something like that. There's Carrie in there. Yeah. And often those films make Carrie references as well.
They always do.
You rarely get through a kind of prom movie without at least one Carrie reference.
Exactly. How many teen movies are structured in exactly this way, where you get the kind of, from She's All That to whatever it might be, you kind of get the kind of quieter girl who then sort of comes out of her shell, then goes to prom and then has the happly ever after kind of thing. Yeah. And it's a sort of twist on that before that trope existed almost.
Yeah, exactly. And it's like, but that's why people don't, I guess people don't kind of relate to those films, or often don't relate to those films in quite the same way, because there's something about them ultimately when you get to the end that doesn't ring true.
Yes, totally.
Whereas there's something about Carrie, although it's firmly rooted in fantasy and it's firmly rooted in the supernatural, it rings true.
Yeah.
There's something in there that's like, I kind of wish...
Yeah.
I wish I could have done that, or I wish something...
It's true.
There's something there that's that feels more real somehow.
A little bit wish fulfillment in a weird, dark way, isn't it? I think because kids are cruel, kids are horrible. I wouldn't want to go back to school again. You know how a lot of people are like, "Oh, I loved high school. Oh, I loved school. I'd love to go back if I could." Not in a million years.
Awful. Unless I had telekinetic powers, which send me back immediately.
Exactly.
And grab your camera.
Would you like a ride? We could call you a cab.
I'm sure she can walk home. And Carrie, you're dismissed from gym for a week. Just take study hall instead, okay?
We're all sorry about this incident, Cassie.
It's Carrie!
So let me ask you about Sissy Spacek then. I mean, we talked about DePalma, but how important is Sissy Spacek to this film?
Yeah, she's everything, isn't she? She's extraordinary. I mean, again, I'm probably kind of telling things that a lot of your listeners already know, because these are stories that DePalma tells all the time. But she wasn't his first choice for Carrie. He had someone else in mind, and he'd worked with Sissy Spacek before. She'd been like a set designer on Phantom of the Paradise.
Oh, right,
because her partner is Jack Fisk, who worked with DePalma, who's worked with DePalma before. So they kind of had a working relationship. But Sissy said that she wanted to audition for Carrie, and DePalma essentially was like, babes, don't bother. I've kind of got someone lined up for it. So she was like, right, fuck you. Like, I'm getting this part. Turned up, lank hair down, like wearing this kind of dowdy outfit, and just blew everyone away. And of course, she got the part. But her performance is extraordinary. She's such a strange creature.
She's so strange.
She's such a kind of physically strange creature, and she's beautiful, but she's unconventionally beautiful.
Yes.
She's got a face like no one else has got a face. You can't think of another actress, a kind of big mainstream American star has a face like Sissy Spacek. It's incredible. But what's weird actually is not weird, but what's funny is that Sissy Spacek in real life was prom queen at her prom. You wouldn't kind of think it. You kind of imagine that she would be this kind of strange,
the weird one,
outcast. Exactly. But she was very popular.
Yeah.
But yeah, she's it's extraordinary. The balance between kind of sadness and this kind of anger and this distress that she has, it just pours out of her eyes. She's so expressive.
Her eyes are incredible. I mean, in some ways, one of the most iconic images in all of horror, I suppose. These images that we all know of Carrie, whether it be her eyes or that shot of her with the pig's blood or whatever, it's that face. Something about that face.
Yeah,
absolutely incredible.
And I think, like Carrie, Sissy Spacek now, like still now, is one of my absolute favourite actresses. And I guess it's similar to why DePalma's kind of my favourite filmmaker. Mm-hmm. And she's one of my favourite actresses. This is all born out of Carrie.
Yeah.
It was such a profound experience for me when I was a child.
Yeah.
That, I would watch anything that either of them did because partly, I love them, partly I think they're great, all these kind of things, but you see moments, I see these flashes of Carrie and these things that excited me so when I was younger. There was, both of them kind of spoke to me in these ways that I've just have never been able to shake.
Yeah, 100%. She is mesmerizing, isn't she? I think, and she like it feels like she does a lot, but at the same time, she's actually very subtle too. Because, like you said, I think it's a lot of stuff just going on in her eyes. It feels like there's a lot of face acting, there's a lot of eye acting, but it never feels. And maybe it's because it kind of complements the filmmaking, but it never feels too big for the film. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. And also, what's really interesting is you kind of remember if you hadn't watched Carrie in a while. It's been a few hours since I've watched it, so I'm already starting to forget. If you haven't seen Carrie in a while, you kind of remember Sissy as being completely central, like almost in it the entire time, like almost as though that film's from her point of view.
Yeah.
But actually, she's not on screen as much as you remember her being. A lot of time is given to Chris, a lot of time is given to Sue. A lot of time exists outside of kind of Carrie's world, and you spend time with the other characters and you kind of understand their motivations and what's going on.
Yeah.
So actually, you're kind of on-screen Carrie time and on-screen Carrie dialogue.
Yes.
Isn't as much as you remember it being. And I think that's partly about because she's such an iconic figure and you think of the film and you think of her. But I think partly it's because Sissy Spacek, the way she inhabits that role, she is in every scene. She haunts every scene. Like everything those characters do, everything is based around Carrie. Like she's this kind of linchpin in the film, but you remember it as being her on screen the whole time. There's something, this kind of presence, this quality that she brings to the film is it's like electric. There's nothing else like it.
I know. And yeah, because I was trying to think, because I haven't read the book since I was at school, but I was trying to remember whether the book isn't like first person from Carrie's perspective, is it? I don't think, because there's also equally like the film, there's a lot of time spent on Sue, right, as a character too.
Yeah, and the book's interesting because the book has this kind of structure where it's kind of partly tells the story in a kind of conventional way, but then it kind of flips back and forth into kind of testimonies and source material that's been written after the fact, where it's like a book that, Sue Sneller's written, or it's kind of police testimonies or something of some of the people that were there on the night. So you get a mixture between this conventional kind of piece of storytelling, and then it's almost like the kind of novel equivalent of like found footage. There's something about, this kind of, this real thing happened, and we're kind of we're seeing this kind of source material, or we're kind of looking back on the case. Exactly. So, DePalma obviously ditched all of that aspect to it. There's something about the book which does kind of come outside of Carrie, and part of it's written after Carrie's gone. Yes. But you get that all throughout the book. So there's you couldn't imagine anyone else but Sissy Spacek, and I think we've seen that, since. I think, there was we can talk a bit more about the remakes in a bit if you want, because I've got lots to say. When you look at kind of Chloe Grace Moretz, who is in the Kimberly Peirce version, and you see how special it was what Sissy Spacek brought to it.
Yes.
And it's not just that she's an unconventional beauty. It's not just that she has a kind of awkwardness, or she conveys an awkwardness so convincingly. It's just that she's it's like she's wandered in from another world.
I know.
You know, it's like she just isn't, like, she wasn't meant for here.
I know,
You know,
absolutely.
It makes me cry thinking about it.
Seriously, yeah. Like, I just find everything she does on screen so emotional for some reason. I absolutely love it. What about everyone else? This kind of the high school teen element. Then characters like Chris and Sue, the coach, the sports coach. I've forgotten her name.
Miss Collins.
Miss Collins. What? I mean, she's obsessed with slapping and touching the children. Have you noticed? Not only is she like slapping them a lot, but other moments she's like touching their faces and stroking their hair. She's very all up in their faces.
You wouldn't get a Miss Collins nowadays. Well, you would, but it'd be a very different story.
I love it. Yeah. What do you think of just the rest of that kind of world then that Carrie inhabits? But we'll get to Margaret later. But the high school world, at least, and the way that these characters are kind of played and portrayed.
Yeah, I mean, they're almost stock to a certain extent. They almost do feel those same things of, you know, she's all that and I've been kissed. It's like the kind of friendly one that tries to do something good, the evil one that tries to do this, the teacher that, you know, whatever it might be. So there's a kind of stock element to them. But I think that there is a richness to each of those characters.
I think so.
I think that there is, you know, I think Sue especially, I think Sue's an amazing character. There's something also really interesting about Sue's motivations as well, which are always slightly muddy.
We never 100% know, do we?
Yeah, it's like I get it, and I'm very much on the side of, like, Sue was trying to do a good thing. Like, Sue was trying to do a nice thing, and it went horribly wrong.
Yes.
But there is a confusion there. There is something, and I think people often say it like the first time they watch the film, and she kind of goes in and she's there and she's kind of watching, and there's just something slightly
very much
unsure about exactly why she was doing what she's doing. But what's kind of really interesting is she's not, you know, if you are to be like, okay, she was doing a good thing, she was doing a nice thing, she's not basically acting out of this kind of altruistic, like, oh, I feel so bad for Carrie, like, I want to make her happy and stuff. Sue's acting for herself. Sue feels guilty. And her response is out of guilt. She's trying to make herself feel better. I think she's not really doing something ultimately for Carrie. I think she's trying to kind of, you know, make amends with herself.
It's true, because so just to remind people, if anyone, you know, hasn't seen it in a while, Sue is obviously the character who is she's set up almost as like one of the mean girls, isn't she? You see her, you know, teasing Carrie in the shower.
She's throwing
the
sanitary towels at the beginning.
Sanitary towels and shouting, and then she obviously feels so much more guilty than the other girls, and then basically makes her boyfriend Tommy not take her to the prom, but take Carrie to the prom. And yeah, you're right, there is this element of, it is, even watching it again this time around, I had to remember, like, does she know what's going to happen to Carrie? Because there's that moment when she suddenly has to leave her family dinner. She's like, I've got to go. And she runs off to the prom in order to see the inauguration, I'm assuming. And again, you think, does she know what the plan is? Is she turning up in order to see it, or is she not? But you're firmly of the belief that she is doing a good thing, or at least she thinks she's doing a good thing. Yeah,
she thinks she's doing a good thing, and she's doing a good thing for herself.
Yeah.
Ultimately, I think. But I think that's another thing that makes Sue quite real.
Yeah.
I think it is this idea of, you know, it's this kind of selfish teenager.
Yeah, totally.
That's just trying to do something. She feels bad. She got into trouble.
Yeah.
She wants to do something to kind of make it right. And, you know, ultimately she's trying to do a kind thing.
Yeah.
You know, similarly, it's, you know, there's something about Tommy, her boyfriend, and, you know, he's in the book, he's much more he's much kind of smarter,
right,
and he's much more you know, just kind of aware of what's going on. Tommy in the film's just a bit of an idiot, really, and, you know, he's fine, he's very sweet. There's something that becomes a little bit unclear, like when they're at the prom, they're dancing together, they kiss. There's something that's almost like you have this moment like, oh, does Tommy kind of like Harry a bit? Like, is there this moment where he thinks, actually, you know, I'm really attracted to you, or I'm really charmed by you, or whatever it might be. But, you know, I think what's particularly kind of fun and a bit mean when it comes to Tommy is, you know, he's really he just gets hit on the head with a bucket and he's gone. You know, he really has the most unceremonious death ever. It's just like,
it's amazing.
But again, it shows that it's like the boys don't matter in this film.
Absolutely,
you know,
not.
it's about the girls. It's not about Tommy. It's like, you've done your bit.
Yes.
You know, he's done what he needs to do, so we can literally just get rid of you now.
Yeah, it's true. And I kind of, again, obviously it's very clear at the beginning that he's reluctantly taking Carrie to the prom because Sue has asked him to. But then, you know, there are those moments, because obviously they set it up as, you know, she compliments his poem in class and he keeps saying, it's like, oh, maybe it's because you liked my poem. And yeah, you do start to think, okay, maybe did he actually warm to her for seeing him as something else other than the dumb jock type, maybe, or something like that, you know? Yeah,
no, absolutely. And then you've got Chris, who's like the bully. I mean, Chris is the best, isn't she? She's great.
So horrible.
She's so fun. Yeah, she's really horrible. There's something about Chris that, you know, she's she is just a villain, really. Like she's the villain of the film. But she's involving. She's interesting. She's not like a villain in the sense that you like booing at her when she's on the screen.
No.
Again, you kind of not relate to her, but you get her.
Yeah.
You know, she's not so extreme. She's not so ridiculous that you can't identify like who she is.
Although it is, I mean, it's pretty,
see a bit of yourself in her sometimes.
It's pretty extreme. It's pretty extreme.
I guess so. But what I mean is, like, I think Chris somehow, even though I'm fully on Carrie's side, of course, and I love her, and like as I was saying, Carrie meant a lot to me, the film growing up, and it was very cathartic for me growing up. But I can still relate to Chris. There's still parts there I can still relate to Chris. And I think there is something about her that goes beyond just this villain. And I think that's what's interesting about Carrie, is I think the idea of the villain is really complicated in that film. And also DePalma's really good at messing with your perspective and changing how you feel about people during that film, because if you look at, there's this kind of scene early on in the film where Miss Collins is talking to the principal, and she's like, oh, these kids, they were just being so mean to Carrie, and she's like, but you know what, I just kind of wanted to grab her and shake her and slap her too. So there's this, from the beginning of the film, you're kind of set up with this idea that Carrie, it's like you feel bad for her, you can feel sorry for her, you can empathize with her, but kind of you want her to pull herself together. Kind of you want to just fucking,
Tell us
get it together, and you want to shake her, and you want to be like, Carrie, you can do this. Like you can fight back, not in the way that she does fight back. You can fight back in another way. And I think the kind of idea of that carries on throughout the film. And then when you get to the prom scene, the way that DePalma sets it up, that scene where basically they're named king and queen of the prom, and they're walking up to the stage, and it cuts between Sue to the bucket to Carrie to Chris to Sue to the bucket to Carrie to Chris. It goes on forever. Like it's all slow motion. It goes on for like 17 minutes or something. All slow motion. Just kind of background dialogue happening. It's extraordinary the way that he sets that up, but he does it in a way that you get to a point where in any other film, the blood would have fallen by now. In any other film, you'd be watching her exacting her telekinetic revenge. But somehow they're still only halfway up to the stage.
Oh, it's amazing.
So you get to a point where actually you're like, pull it. Just pull. So it's like this thing that you were dreading, this thing that you don't want to happen. You end up with Chris almost wanting to like just fucking grab the rope yourself and pull it just to get it over with, because it's so tense and it's so sad and it's so drawn out. So there's something really manipulative about the way that DePalma sets up that scene. It's really clever. But he switches you between the points of view of those three women like 20 times in the space of like 15 minutes. And in these moments, you understand all of them. And I think that's what's incredible about it. That's what means that Sue's not just the nice girl, Chris just isn't the bully, and Carrie's not just this kind of villain. They're all kind of complicated. And they all mean something to each other, and what's going to happen here is going to affect each of them. There's kind of something there that's really invested in these characters. And DePalma knows how to exploit that. And he knows how to play with you. And then you have this thing that she pulls it, the bucket falls, you see Carrie, and then you kind of feel bad because you had this moment where you were like, pull it,
get on
just
with it.
get it over with. It's extraordinary. I think that whole scene is really amazing in the position he puts you as the viewer in.
Oh my God, so much more to talk about with this film. We've got to talk about the prom in depth. We've got to talk about Margaret White. We've got to talk about that ending. Before we go any further, I want to head on over to our brand new regular segment, Wild About Horror. And this is where we hear a few thoughts from Freudian cinephile Mary Wild about this week's film. So here we go. Here are Mary's thoughts on Brian De Palma's Carrie.
Hey Mike, Mary Wild here again. How exciting that this week you're covering Brian De Palma's supernatural horror freakout, Carrie. I find this movie fascinating and wanted to share a few thoughts with you and your podcast listeners. It's difficult to speak about this film without mentioning the girls' locker room scene right at the beginning. Teenager Carrie suffers from extreme shyness and is a target of bullies. Unfortunately for her, she happens to experience her first ever menstruation as she showers after high school gym class. Unaware of what is happening to her body, she panics and pleads for help. The other female students respond by pelting Carrie with tampons, laughing and mocking her. The scene taps into anxiety dreams and repressed traumas, not only around the function of women's bodies, but also the stigmatized social perception of our anatomy. Here, menstrual blood stands in for a corporeal derangement where meaning collapses. The physical manifestation of womanhood, because of the taboo element of the body, comes to represent a repulsive, filthy fluid signifying disease and death. Later in the film, the students dumping pig blood on prom queen Carrie harks back to the opening blood scene. We learn that Carrie is abused by her fanatically religious mother. The central drama of the story relates to telekinesis. Carrie discovers her ability to move objects at a distance by mental power alone. She ultimately asserts her power and stands up to her tyrannical mother. This can be seen as a battle of paranormal forces, superstitious, moralistic, religious dogma versus extrasensory capabilities, and Carrie emerges as the winner. The way the notorious prom crowning scene is structured is that on the surface, Carrie is being applauded and celebrated by her peers and teachers. But below the stage, her adversaries are plotting a cruel prank, aiming to humiliate Carrie and ruining a rare moment for her when she appears finally accepted and popular. The topographic representation of this scene shows a positive fronting face covering up a dark, vindictive, violent underbelly that dictates the hypocritical terms of society. In the prom scene, Carrie morphs from an introverted wallflower into a monstrous avenger in one fell swoop. After the prank is played and she is drenched in blood, she hallucinates that everyone is laughing at her and unleashes telekinetic fury upon the high school students and faculty. Standing still on the stage, she slams shut gymnasium doors, assaults people with a high-pressure water hose, and electrocutes the principal using the power of her mind alone. As the gym catches fire, Carrie calmly walks out and locks the remaining students inside to burn to death. Brian De Palma's iconic reliance on the split screen here lends itself to a study of abjection. In Powers of Horror, Julia Kristeva writes about the abject as the state of being cast off, with connotations of degradation, disturbing conventional identity. Kristeva describes subjective horror as the experience of corporeal reality, a breakdown in the distinction between the self and others, a process by which one separates from what is considered intolerable and infringing upon oneself. The abject is that which is rejected by the communal consensus that underpins a social order. The split screen doubles down on Carrie's state of being cast out and marginalized. Even in the orgy of violence she ignites, she remains split off from it, dissociated and isolated from the experience of corporeality. Kristeva also says that abjection is done to the part of ourselves that we exclude. From a psychoanalytic standpoint, this is always the mother. We must abject the maternal, the object that created us, in order to construct an identity of our very own. And the film Carrie is a turbocharged, high-octane example of separating from the mother. Puberty, menstruation, and transformation of the body usher in an opportunity for the female adolescent to assert her autonomy as she matures. We hear Carrie say at one point, "If I concentrate hard enough, I can move things." This becomes a symbol of her intentional capacity to dictate her own terms, overthrowing the mother's religious coercion and emancipating herself from forces that attempt to crush her.
A big thank you there to the wonderful Mary Wild. So good to hear her perspective on this wonderful movie. Don't forget, if you want to hear more thoughts from Mary Wild, follow her on Twitter @PsychStar to hear about upcoming courses. And you can also listen to her podcast that she does with Sarah Cleaver. That is the Projections Podcast.
It is happening again. It is happening again.
Oh, that was a little clip you heard there from one of the creepiest and most horrific moments in David Lynch's Twin Peaks. And that is what we've got going on over on Patreon this week. We were up to part 4 of our exclusive Twin Peaks mini-season, which is only available for $10 patrons. This week we talked about the first half of Season 2. Season 2 is an interesting one. It has a kind of it's sort of mixed in terms of what people think of it. It's quite divisive. Some people hate Season 2. I think that it's a mixed bag, but it does contain some of the scariest and most beautiful episodes in the program's history. So it was so much fun to talk about Twin Peaks Series 2 this week with co-host of the Ghibliotheque podcast, Jake Cunningham. If you want to listen to this and the rest of our Twin Peaks mini-season, as well as a whole bunch of other bonus content, then you can simply sign up to our Patreon. Head over to patreon.com/evolutionofhorror. And if you support this podcast by giving a little bit of money per month, you'll be treated to bonus content. For $5 per month, you will get a bonus episode every other week, and that could be anything from a review of a new release to a mailbag episode in which I answer questions to just a general discussion of an old classic. That's all available every other week for $5 patrons, and if you go up to the $10 level, you will get access to our exclusive mini-seasons, including the aforementioned Twin Peaks one, and also, starting very soon, a whole mini-season on cinema of the extreme. That's going to be an exclusive series of episodes with me, Zobo with a Shotgun, and Brad Hansen, in which we talk about Guinea Pig, a Serbian film, Cannibal Holocaust, and a whole bunch of other horrible movies. So you get access to all of that, and you get sent an Evolution of Horror sticker if you're UK based, and for every new donor who signs up, they'll also get a very special thank you on the main podcast. Speaking of, I'm going to give everybody who signed up in the last couple of weeks a very special shout out and a thank you. So here we go. A huge thanks to Varun M. Shah, Kieran Callow, James Abbott, Dominic Mezzanotte, Jen Jurgens, Robert Johnson, Philip Squire, Samantha Luck, Paul Ducker, Philip Hunt, T-Dag, and Sarah B. A huge thank you to all of those people for signing up in the last couple of weeks. And one more time, if you want to join them and get involved and be treated to all of this bonus content and much more, head on over to patreon.com/evolutionofhorror. That's patreon.com/evolutionofhorror. Okay, let's return to mine and Michael's discussion of Brian DePalma's Carrie.
And God made Eve from the rib of Adam, and Eve was weak and loosed the raven on the world, and the raven was called sin. Say it. The raven was called sin.
Why didn't you tell me, Mama?
Say it.
No.
The raven was called sin.
Ooh, Mama, and the raven was called sin.
Okay, I've got to ask you then about what I consider to be the scariest element of this film. I mean, we've talked about the high school element, the bullying, these other school characters, the teachers. We've talked about DePalma and Stephen King and Sissy Spacek, but there's one key player we haven't talked about yet, Michael, and that is Carrie's mother, Margaret White, played by the incredible Piper Laurie. It's almost like we're in another film, right? When Carrie comes home from this kind of brightly lit, polished, glossy-looking high school, she then walks into this house, and her house is like, it's like something out of a Universal horror film, isn't it? It's like a kind of gothic old haunted house, lit by candles and all of the creepy religious imagery. Tell me what you think of this. What are your thoughts about Margaret and Carrie and Margaret's relationship and this home life?
The house is so interesting as well, because I feel like people don't really talk about the house that much. But what's really interesting about the house, and absolutely you're right, this kind of gothic quality that it has to it. But what's really interesting about the house as well on the inside is it's also really unfinished. It's really sad.
Yeah.
It's really run down. It's really, like the way the stairs are just this kind of hole in the floor outside of Carrie's room. There's no banister. It's this sense of something that was started that wasn't finished. It's this sense of something that's kind of, that doesn't matter.
Yes.
And you really understand in their house about what Margaret White, her mother, values, and it's not about what we have. It's not about the stuff around us.
There's
it's
a
not
kind
about
of Puritan aspect, isn't there?
Exactly. It's not about creating a safe space at home, a space that you feel comfortable and relaxed and happy and loved. It's just a means to an end. You just have this place that you live, and you have this place that you're based, and a place where you worship, essentially.
Yeah.
So I think there is a kind of something so desolate and so bare and so sad about that house that doesn't often get talked about. And I think that when you rightly talk about this kind of Gothic quality, but when you think of Gothic, you think of opulence.
Yes.
And you think of, you know, vast kind of sprawling rooms and corridors and this kind of, but it's not that. It's bare and it's bleak.
It's like the Leatherface house more, but with candles.
But with just more pictures of Jesus rather than bones.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, Lord! Help the sinning woman see the sin of her days and ways. Show her that if she had remained sinless, the curse of blood would never have come on her. She may have been tempted by the Antichrist. She may have committed the sin of lustful thoughts.
No, Mama.
Oh, don't lie to me, Carrietta. Don't you know by now I can see inside you? I can see the sin as surely as God can. We'll pray.
No.
We'll pray, woman.
No.
Pray to Jesus for our lustful sinning souls.
It's really, I still find it very creepy that the sort of first moment when, you know, she finds out Carrie's had her first period and she's kind of then making her pray and locks her drags her across the house, locking her in the cupboard, the horrible Jesus statue in the cupboard. And everything.
Which is, it's not Jesus.
Is it not?
Because everyone's always like, oh, the ugliest Jesus statue you've ever seen. It's Saint Sebastian.
Oh, is it? Oh,
yeah, so who was killed with the arrows and who was like a kind of, you know, religious Christian martyr.
Right. I went to a Catholic primary school. I should have known.
But I thought it was Jesus for years.
Yeah.
But I think it's also interesting to kind of watch it again and think of San Sebastian as this, you know, this kind of martyred figure, and this idea of this kind of thing, that this deity that Carrie's praying to, and this position that, you know, Margaret ends up in her death. It's a kind of replication of the, you know, the death of Saint Sebastian.
Yeah. Is it a replication? I mean, Brian DePalma didn't make that obvious.
Yeah. For a second there, I was like, Mike, have you seen Carrie? Yeah, exactly. So there's, but the house is horrific, but those scenes at home are really devastating. But, you know, Piper Laurie, who said that when she read it and she kind of thought like, oh, who is this woman? Like, how am I going to play this? And then she has often talked about how her interpretation of it is that it was like satire. It was black comedy.
Yeah.
Which is, you know, fine if that's what you did to get that performance.
Yeah.
For me, it's not that funny. It's not, I mean, I guess there is some kind of satire in there, but it's, you know, it's really upsetting to watch.
It is upsetting, yeah.
You know, I'd find it weird if I was watching Carrie with someone, they were kind of chuckling through the scenes of Piper Laurie and her at home. But I guess there is a kind of extreme nature to her performance. There is something, it is big. That is kind of, you know, it kind of fights against the kind of meekness of Sissy Spacek in those scenes. And, you know, the way that De Palma positions them, like Carrie's always lower, Margaret White's always higher. You know, there's always kind of ways, and it's like, actually, you know, when Carrie defies her and goes to the prom, she's like, get down, and pushes her, like, you know, mentally pushes her down to the bed, and it's like Carrie is finally above Margaret White. But, you know, there's something about the way it kind of sets up, and it is, you know, Piper Laurie, her performance is bigger, it's more extreme. So I guess, you know, this idea of kind of satire or kind of slightly kind of comic aspect does ring true, but it doesn't make it any less horrific.
Yes.
But also what it does lend to Carrie is a kind of a camp quality to it as well, which I think is something, you know, it's like queers love Carrie.
Right,
you know, it's again, it's like wish fulfillment. You know, it's about like revenge on the bullies, but they love Margaret White. You know, like we love I Can See Your Dirty Pillows. You know, it's like you watch RuPaul's Drag Race, it's like there's been many Carrie Whites walking down the runway.
Right.
You know, it's very much, there is something there, and I think there's something about like extreme femininity that's often appealing, particularly to gay men. It's very central to this idea of camp, and I think in lots of ways Margaret White is interesting because she embodies that, but in a way that's absolutely stripped of any glamour.
Yeah, you're right. It's so true, actually. I suppose there is a kind of campness to it. That kind of monstrously over the top woman in some, but almost a little bit Whatever Happened to Baby Jane-esque or something. Yeah, definitely.
She's very quotable.
Yes.
You know, she's very, you can steal a Margaret White one-liner and kind of throw it out in some kind of bitchy reading session.
Go away. Stop it, Mama. Stop hurting yourself, Mama.
He's gonna laugh at you. They're all gonna laugh at you.
Laugh at
It's
me.
not too late. You can stay here with me.
don't want to stay with you, Mama.
Look, I'll answer the door and I'll tell him that you're sick. I'll tell him that you changed your mind.
Sit down and be quiet!
Sissy Spacek and Piper Laurie both nominated for Oscars.
Of course.
Which was like really unheard of.
Yeah.
Like two women who are, two characters in a horror movie, and not just like a, this isn't a like, oh, it's kind of a horror movie, but we can kind of get away by saying it's not a horror movie. It carries a pure horror movie.
Yeah, totally.
It's bloody, it's crazy, it's, it's very rooted in the unreal. To see them both kind of nominated was really a really extraordinary thing. A testament to their fine work.
Oh, so good. What's Margaret's story then, do you think? Was she in some sort of abusive marriage? I mean, she talks about how he was maybe, he had whiskey on his breath, and she talks about all that stuff, but then is it just simply that he left her for another woman? Yeah,
again, I think that's open to interpretation. So there's a kind of... There's some... Perhaps you could take some kind of hint or indication that Carrie was conceived out of rape.
Yes.
But I think more likely or more kind of convincingly for me is that she was conceived in like a moment of weakness. Yeah. And it's something that Margaret's felt that she's paying the price for ever since. And Carrie is this, something that was born out of an unspeakable act that she should have had the power to resist, that she didn't. So Carrie, was always going to be something that she kind of resented, something that represented something awful that she did. Mm-hmm. So again, it's like it's much in the way that Sue is, or that Miss Collins is. Margaret's another character that is reacting out of guilt and shame.
Yes.
It's a guilt and shame that people carry with themselves throughout Carrie. Mm-hmm. Is really interesting. It's interesting if we go back to thinking about what Barbara Creed was saying about the blood and the pig's blood and the menstrual blood that's shed in that film as being born out of kind of shame and humiliation. And I think this idea of shame is something that exists throughout the film, and guilt, I think, is like a very powerful kind of potent quality that a lot of the women carry with them in that film, and Margaret absolutely does. But the way that it manifests through her is this kind of extreme kind of overzealous religious mania that she forces on her child, and she forces on the people around her. What's I think really key about the fact that the first time we meet Margaret is not at home.
Yeah.
It's her visiting Sue's mum, is the fact that it adds this other layer to people know what she's like. People know what Carrie's home life is like, but no one does anything. No one tries to stop it. No one tries to help Carrie. Mm-hmm. It's not like she's this weird girl, but we don't know what goes on behind locked doors.
Yeah.
It's very easy for people to know what's happening. This child is essentially being abused.
Yeah.
But no one's doing anything to stop that.
It's true. As all of the other human beings, again, it goes back to what you were saying. There's even that moment when the mum, obviously, she gives her some money, but it's just to get rid of her, right? Again, it's that kind of selfish act by trying to do something that seems generous, I suppose, in some ways.
Exactly.
It's like, here, take this tenner. That's really interesting. So let's talk finally about the prom then, and then we'll get to the ending. But we've talked about the prom a bit already. It feels like there's almost like dreamlike quality to it, doesn't there? I suppose that kind of runs all the way throughout, but that moment when she's dancing with Tommy, what do you make of that decision in terms of the way that the camera is working there in that particular moment when they're dancing together?
Oh, it's just... I'm just smiling now thinking about it. It's just beautiful. It's beautiful. It's, I think there's very kind of literal ways that you can think about it. It's this idea of Carrie in this moment of actual kind of pure joy that she's never experienced before, and this idea of just this room spinning, like literally she's spinning, she's elated. There's an unreality to the way that the camera moves around them, to the way that they spin. They're on a little spinning turntable and the camera's going the other way around them. It's like they're floating and spinning around. It's like a dream sequence, or
it is,
whatever it might be. So there's a very literal, like, why he chose to shoot it like that. But again, it's a moment that goes on for such a long time.
Yes.
And it's like, it's a classic thing. Like, by then people are like, oh my God, I feel sick. I can't watch this anymore. I need to stop the spinning.
Yeah.
But there is something about this idea of wish fulfillment and fantasy and dream come true that turns to like horror and nausea.
Yes.
There's kind of something there that I wonder if that was part of his thinking. I wonder if it's part of his thinking that, like, actually once the kind of magical facade disappears,
you feel
I kind of want this to end now. I think it's a really, really extraordinary moment.
Carrie, we're here. And we're together. And I like it. I do, I like it.
But tonight there's only me. I
It's that element of excess as well, isn't it? It reminds me again of something you mentioned when we talked about Fulci, where these moments are always just pushed a little bit too long, aren't they? They go on just a little bit longer than you think.
Yeah. De Palma loves to really make a scene last, doesn't he?
Yeah.
But I think also because like his technical setups are so extreme and they're such a huge like undertaking. He's like, I'm going to get them make the most out of this.
Yeah, absolutely.
This isn't going to be a 10-second cutaway. This is going to be like a 15-minute moment. We're just going to watch them spin until we're sick.
Totally. And do you know what? Like you said, the story itself is quite simple, right? I mean, in some ways, without some of these flourishes, it could have been quite a short film in some ways. You know,
it's a very short book.
It's a very short book, and I actually said this when I watched it the other night, that like I almost forgot how quickly we're suddenly at the prom. I felt like there was a lot more stuff that happened in the middle before we get to them all trying on their outfits and then them all heading straight to prom. Because I guess you always think about in some ways that prom sequence being the end of the film, but actually it's a big chunk of the film, isn't it? That's the thing, because it's a long sequence. Yeah.
It's a strange. It's such a strange sequence. I think the kind of prom sequence in Carrie, and when I talk about the prom sequence, I mean from when the blood drops to when she leaves. You know, the kind of horror moment of it is there's a kind of quietness to it, a coldness to it.
Yeah.
You know, the blood falls and this kind of droning noise just plays out in the background, this kind of buzzing sound.
Yes.
You know, it's not... It's operatic in a certain way because there's a lot going on, and the way he shoots it in the split screen moves, he bathes it in a red filter, he does all these kind of tricks. But it suddenly becomes sad and sparse and cruel and cold. There's something about it that's not... You know, again, it's where the gimmicks for me don't interfere with what's happening. And I think what's really important in that scene is that you get a sense of Carrie. She's almost like in a trance when it happens.
Yes.
We're all sorry, Cassie. We're all sorry, Cassie.
You know, I think that what's really important about Carrie is, you know, Carrie doesn't master her skills. You know, Carrie doesn't spend that film. It's not Matilda. She doesn't spend the time like planning, mastering her skills so she can do this thing. It's not a plan. Like, she never thought this was going to happen. Mm-hmm. And when it does happen, it's like her body just takes over. Like, she's got no control on what she's doing. Her wide-eyed look, you know, even when it first happens, the blood falls on her, she looks at the audience and there's this kind of kaleidoscopic effect that De Palma uses. And it's like a kind of someone putting a spinning wheel in your face and being like, you're feeling sleepy. You know, someone hypnonizing you. You know, she's literally being lulled into this state that she's in. And then it clicks in and then this droning sound happens. And it's like she blacks out while it happens. You know, it's perfect the way he does it. And he's talked about his use of split screen, which he uses lots in his films. He loves split screen, and he loves it as a kind of way of storytelling and letting audiences choose what they want to look at, and kind of staggered storytelling in the way that you can do with split screen. And he's talked about how he doesn't often, you know, he doesn't think necessarily he got it exactly right with Carrie, and he actually pulled out a lot of the split screen. I think it was originally going to be entirely split screen. Right. There's only moments of split screen in that prom sequence, and you know, I think De Palma talks about it as maybe not being entirely successful because he's such a methodical filmmaker, and he's such a filmmaker focused on storytelling, and this happens, which means this happens, which means this happens, and this is the effect. Whereas actually the kind of reverse happens with Carrie, and what he doesn't think is successful, I think is perfect, is he creates chaos. Yes. You don't know where to look when you're watching that prom sequence, and it's fun when you watch it again to watch the other side, because you know, quite often it's like there's so much going on that you don't know kind of what's really happening. So it's a very under Palma scene in lots of ways. That's really interesting, because it is about an absolute lack of control, but that's what Carrie's experiencing. Like, you ask Carrie like what happened in the last 10 minutes, she'd be like, I don't know. And it's like you ask, you know, an audience member, it's like, what just happened? They're like, I caught some of it. And
there was a hose.
You know, exactly. So, and it's like characters like the you know, the principal is kind of pinned against the wall and set on fire, and you're not really watching that until he's already on fire, but actually if you watch you can see him go back, but you're not really directed to be looking where you might think you might be directed to looking, and I think that's very not Brian De Palma.
That's really interesting, because I kind of in some ways just thought of it as being a really perfectly methodical way of doing that stuff, because in some ways it was, especially the moments when you see her, you know, making stuff happen instantly, it was a good way to kind of just very, you know, simply portray that telekinesis, I suppose. You see her eyes move towards something and then you see the door shut, or you see something move, you know?
Yeah, no, and absolutely, there is that aspect to it. There is that very kind of literal, like, she does things, and like quite often in the split screen, her face is on one side and then action's on the other. But there are many moments where it does drift away from that. Yeah. And you are in this moment of like, I'm kind of looking at both at the same time, and I'm kind of losing what's going on. Yeah. I think it needs that sense of kind of chaos and that sense of... Totally. Like, this horror that's unfolding that's out of anyone's control and no one saw coming.
And that moment, you're right, I guess it's one of the few moments when we are kind of almost entirely in her head, that kind of kaleidoscopic moment, right? Because it looks as though suddenly people like Miss Collins are suddenly laughing at her too, right? Which clearly they're not, but we're suddenly in that trance.
Yeah, so it's like we're you know, we're in Carrie's point of view, but we're in her like inner mind's point of view. Like, we're not just seeing what she's literally seeing. Yeah. But again, it's like, it's that mind and body thing, isn't it? It's like, is she kind of controlling what's happening with her mind, or is this just a physical impulse to what's happening that she's completely out of control?
And that's a brilliant thing about what we're seeing there in her face, because you don't see this typical kind of angry, vengeful kind of looking person. You just see someone that looks like they are in complete shock and trauma throughout that scene, right? And it doesn't really look as though she's controlling what's happening. You know?
Exactly. I think this is why, and I mentioned earlier about the kind of remakes. Yes. And I was like, I have a lot to say, but I have a lot to say about this when it comes to the remakes. And that I think that what's really interesting about Carrie is that, you know, he's made what is, you know, holds up as one of the kind of great horror movies. I mean, obviously the best horror movie ever made. But, you know, it's a film that's consistently talked about, and it's a film that is claimed by some people to be a kind of feminist horror movie. It's claimed by some people to be a really important, empowering film about kind of women's experience or kind of women's trauma. But at the same time, it's made by De Palma. You know, it's like, there's your detractors as well. There's people that think it is a real kind of exercise in misogyny and kind of victimizing women and turning the body into something monstrous. So then, you know, we cut to, there's the TV remake, which we'll kind of gloss over. It was fine, but it just existed and whatever. But then, you know, in the, what was it, 2013? Yeah, 2013. Was Kimberly Peirce's Carrie, and she had, you know, Kimberly Peirce had made Boys Don't Cry. So, you know, interesting film thinking about kind of gender and gender roles and gender portrayal on screen. She had talked about how her remake was going to be a return to the source novel and wouldn't be a remake of De Palma's film. It'd be an adaptation of King's book. Yes. And, you know, I mean, I didn't want to see a remake, but I was kind of up for it. I was kind of thinking this could be an interesting take. And for me, it really wasn't an interesting take. I think it was a remake of De Palma's film that she fluffed. Yeah. But I think the main problem for me is the way that she sets up Carrie's control of her telekinesis, I think is the problem. I think that in Kimberly Peirce's version, we have scenes where she's in her room and she's literally like making all these books levitate around her. Yeah. She's controlling stuff and she's kind of perfecting her powers, and she is Matilda. Yeah. She does have that moment where she's at home, she's practicing what's happening. Yeah. Because it's like she's planning for something. She's planning a revenge, and she might not quite know when it's going to happen, but she knows it's going to happen. Yes. So then we cut to the prom sequence. The blood falls. She clicks into, you know, like telekinetic mode. And she's controlling it. She's doing what she's supposed to be doing. She's doing what she's been practicing doing for the last however many months. And she's exacting revenge. She's self-consciously killing off the people that have done this to her, and the innocent bystanders that happen to be there as well. Mm-hmm. So it's like, actually what Kimberly Peirce actually ended up doing was turning Carrie into the monster. And I think that's the thing that Carrie never is. Yes. You might argue that she's monstrous in some parts of De Palma's film, but I don't think she's never the monster. She's Frankenstein. She's the victim. Yeah. You know, she's the absolute victim in that film, whereas she's not the victim anymore in Kimberly Peirce's film. She's a pure antagonist. Exactly. And she's out to kill. Yes. And I think it's really depressing that that's what happened. Yeah. I think it's really far away from King's original text. It's a million miles away from what De Palma did. Yeah. And I think the weird thing is it makes it completely anti-feminist in lots of ways. Yes. I think it really does what it kind of shouldn't do. So I think what Pierce, perhaps I don't want to kind of say this is what she was trying to do, but I kind of get a sense perhaps she was trying to create a character that had more control and had more of an agency and a sense of kind of control that was happening.
Yeah.
But the way that I think that she went about doing that was wrong, because control is the one thing that she should never have during the prom.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Yeah, and then it just makes her that little bit more villainous almost, right?
So basically when Carrie's killed at the end of Kimberly Pierce's version, you're like, well, good, because what other, she's just gonna, this is what she wants
cause
to
havoc.
do.
Yeah, exactly.
It's like, whereas when Carrie dies at the end of DePalma's film, you're like, this is devastating.
Yeah,
how sad that this happened.
Yeah, that she's literally a victim from beginning to end, basically, isn't she? Yeah. Before we move on from the prom sequence, let me just ask you one more time about just that iconic, that moment when the blood falls. You mentioned there's that kind of drone. I mean, how important is both sound design to this moment when you hear the bucket and everything else, and also the lighting, again, must be one of the most iconic shots in cinema, let alone horror, right? Carrie stood there with the blood over her. Why is that just such an iconic moment in cinema?
Who knows? It's just perfect, isn't it? It's just the framing, the lighting, everything you're talking about. It's just so perfect. But I think also, as we're saying, for audiences, it's what you paid the money for. Do you know what I mean? It's like that image was on the poster.
Yes.
It's very marketed that we know that that's what's coming. It was never a surprise. It was never hidden from you. And you spend the film waiting for it. Yeah. And you, like we were saying, especially in the kind of setup to that moment, in the kind of extended slow motion sequence, you end up just crying out for it, like pull the rope, like let's cover her in the blood, and you feel terrible for thinking this, but you there's part of you that wants this. So I think there is this moment of relief when it happens, which is really weird, because it's kind of the opposite of what you would think would be. It's, there's sadness in there, there's horror, there's all those things, but there's relief for an audience that's been holding their breath for 15 minutes.
Yeah, it's kind of like after the moment after a jump scare or something, isn't it? Yeah. It's like almost like, whew, okay, it's happened. You know?
Exactly. It's like, it's just a perfect moment. Sissy's face, her eyes, everything about it. I mean, I've got it tattooed on my arm, so it's people often kind of see this the tattoo I've got of Carrie covered in blood, and they're like, oh, that's horrible, and I'm like, no, it's beautiful.
It's beautiful.
How dare you say that is horrible?
And then there's this really sad, incredible ending. She goes home, she takes a bath, Carrie's mum is waiting there behind the door, the death. What do you think of this sort of final moment that takes place in the house? Well, nearly final moment.
It's devastating stuff. But again, I think we find ourselves in another kind of moment of slight confusion at the end, where it's like, what's happening when the house falls down? What's happening there? Is this an act of God? Is this a moment? Is Carrie pulling the house down? And I think because there was originally filmed a sequence at the beginning of the film of when Carrie was, when she was younger, in which she makes stones rain down on the house, and DePalma cut the scene, right? So it's not in the film. It's like there are kind of I don't know if physically you can see this anywhere. It's like my life's ambition is to be able to see this footage, but you can see stills from it still now of like Sissy Spacek dressed up like she's a little girl.
Oh wow! So it was actually Sissy Spacek.
There was kind of moments, but it didn't work, or he wasn't happy with how it turned out. So there was a kind of moment at the end where these kind of holes are happening and things, and it's like stones coming through. So it's like she's doing that again, and I think there is a little bit of kind of confusion at the end as to exactly what's happening without that bit at the beginning, because some people kind of claim or think that it is an act of God, like it's a kind of like another outside force that's kind of tearing this house down.
Oh, interesting.
Because the way that she seems to be like, and trying to run away from it, it's like, is she doing this? Why is she running away from it? What's kind of going on? But again, I like that aspect of confusion. I like that aspect of her not being in control.
That's what it feels like to me, that it was always just she's completely lost control of herself.
Exactly.
Right?
Like she's literally just, it's imploding, like everything's coming in.
And it's that horrific guilt that she feels, isn't it? Having just killed her own mother as well. It's going from kind of a self-defense kill to then feeling absolutely devastated by it, isn't she?
That whole last sequence in the house is really sad, and it's very there's a kind of heaviness to it, and there's a kind of bleakness in kind of what happens. But Brian De Palma being Brian De Palma, he does. Brian loves a cheap shot, which I love about him. So it's like you have this moment, and at the end of the book, basically Carrie stops Margaret White's heart.
Mm-hmm.
She like pictures it and kind of crushes it, kind of thing. And
yes,
it's,
that's right.
and De Palma's like, oh, how uncinematic can you get someone just thinking that someone else is going to die?
Yeah.
So create this scene where Carrie, flies these kitchen utensils at her and she's pinned to the wall like Saint Sebastian and dies like that. And it's all it's all very sad and dramatic and stuff until like the final one where he's like has it spinning and going like through the air, and it's almost like that was like popped out of another film. It was like a much cheaper, sillier horror movie that he kind of inserted this little bit in. I always think it's like a funny little gag that he put in.
That's brilliant. I love it. And is she or is she not making some kind of orgasm
she's
noise?
Fully having an orgasm at the end. Yeah. But again, it's like this kind of religious ecstasy.
Yes.
This idea of like sexual
martyrdom.
Godliness and sexuality. And it's all there. But she fully, and I think has. Well, I like to think that's her first orgasm.
Yes, yeah. That's
which is why
true.
She's enjoying it so much.
Yes, exactly. She's
it goes on, and it's just she really is.
It's a really good scene. It's a really sad scene too, because especially that whole sequence where Carrie is having a bath, and you just think it seems like she still hasn't really processed what's just happened to her, right? Like she's still in just this kind of like shock mode almost.
Yeah.
Like she's not really emoting in the conventional sense still that we're seeing,
Yeah, and all she wants is literally like for her mum to give her a hug.
Give her a hug. Oh, fucking hell, yeah. So sad. And then the final, again, often, you always see this final moment of Carrie kind of topping lists of like the greatest jump scares and stuff. And weirdly, until that, it's not a film that's got a lot of jump scares or conventional horror in that regard. And then we have this incredible hand coming out of the grave moment. What do you think of that? Again, is it a cheap shot or does it work?
I think it's not necessarily cheap shot because it was quite it was kind of one of the first, really.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? So it wasn't like this was really new. This was like, Carrie kind of in a lot invented that
it.
Final jump scare.
Yeah.
So, so it's kind of not a cheap shot. It was actually like really a really incredible thing which kind of shaped horror cinema to come.
Yeah.
What's interesting about it is that for me it's the only moment in the film where it firmly is Carrie's the monster. Like it turns Carrie into the thing to be scared of.
Yes.
You see
she's like a zombie coming out of the ground.
Exactly. It's like, with the thing like Carrie White burns in hell on the cross above the thing, and then her bloody hand comes out, and it's like she is the thing that's now to be scared.
Yes.
But, of course we're seeing this through Sue's perspective. This is Sue's dream.
Yes.
So like we're seeing Carrie's kaleidoscopic, unreal vision of what's happening in front of her. This is Sue's unreal or kind of dreamed interpretation or reaction to this traumatic thing she's been through.
She's still feeling that guilt, right?
Exactly. So it's not a kind of a reliable thing we're seeing from someone else's point of view. So, you could say that Carrie's not the monster in there because this isn't actually really happening, and it's just Sue's trauma and Sue's guilt and all these kind of different things. But, but it is interesting in a film that sets her up all the way through to be this figure to empathize with, and to hopefully you can kind of identify in some way, and you can feel sad, you can feel catharsis through her, you mourn her, and at the end she's reduced to a hand out of the grave. It's like got ya kind of moment.
You're right, because until that point she herself is never scary, is she?
No, exactly. But she is in that moment, and what's so great about that moment is you watch it again, her hand comes out very slowly. It's just music. It's all based on music. It's not even a jump scare. It's just like it's such a slow movement out of the grave, but there's just
it works.
There's something about the music. There's something about the way the rock moves and her hand comes. It's so beautiful. And, and that was Sissy's hand as well. She always says, she was like, no one's crawling in there and doing that thing. Like that's Carrie's hand. That's my hand.
I love it.
Her hand that comes
You're right.
Out.
It is. It always surprises me that it's kind of gradual for a shock scare, isn't it? Compared to like an Evil Dead type kind of loud chord and hand coming out. Yeah.
But it's like I think that kind of that sharp jolt, that would have felt cheap.
Yes, exactly.
I think a slow hand coming out of the grave is classier.
I agree.
It's sophisticated.
And it's maybe it's also, again, it's like the prom scene. It's like, it's very slow build up, isn't it? It's a long time for Sue to kind of approach that grave, read it, kneel down with that music, very over the top kind of melancholy, soapy music.
Yeah, he loves that kind of those soapy strings. And that scene, that was the one that he filmed backwards and then played forwards to give it this kind of dreamlike quality. And there's the cute thing, you can see a car driving backwards in the background if you watch it back.
I didn't actually realise that. So he filmed that backwards and then reversed it.
Yeah.
So he did that long before David Lynch did dream sequences.
Yeah, exactly. But you can see cars driving backwards in the background and stuff. Amazing. It's very cute. And that final jump scene, he literally replicated in Dressed to Kill.
Yes.
And it's like the final section of Dressed to Kill is the same scale, like literally exactly like in terms of like a jump cut to a person in bed waking up, the way that the camera's, the way that it's shot, it's the same moment. So I love the fact that people always accuse DePalma of being like a rip-off merchant, like he steals from Hitchcock, he's really unoriginal, he's this, and he's like, well, do you know what, if they're going to accuse me of stealing, I'm literally going to steal a scene from my own film myself. And do it again because it was so good. I really respect that. De Palma's never an imitator.
Yes.
I think, what he does is very, very distinctly his own. Totally. And I think to a certain extent what's interesting about De Palma is he gets to make the real kind of, if we're talking into kind of Blowout and Dressed to Kill territory, he makes the really uncompromising, sleazy films that Hitchcock would have made if he would have stayed alive.
Yeah, totally.
Like if Hitchcock had been working in the 80s, like it'd been boobs everywhere.
Oh god, yeah, because even towards the very end of
Body Double.
Yeah, even towards the very end of Hitchcock's career, you see that start to creep in, don't you? Yeah, you're so right. And actually, he isn't just somebody that, like you say, he isn't just somebody that apes other styles, because there is now such a thing as a De Palma style too, right? I mean, you see people like Tarantino, even in times like Kill Bill, embrace this Brian De Palma style with that kind of those split screens and all those little visual kind of cues and music cues.
It's like kind of this cross between this kind of beautiful Baroque artistic filmmaking with kind of soap opera values. Sometimes there's like a cross between
again it's a very David Lynch thing, actually.
Absolutely. We've talked before about this kind of like high art, low art thing with horror. I love films that are kind of battling those two things at once within the same movie. I think Brian De Palma often does that.
Yes, arty trash.
Exactly.
Love it.
Yes.
Amazing. Well, let me ask you finally about. We talked about the remake. What about the sequel? Rage, is it? The Rage,
Carrie 2?
This was in the kind of like 90s horror teen cycle era, wasn't it? I remember actually seeing it at the time. Any thoughts or memories of that film?
Yeah, I mean, it's terrible, isn't it? It's really terrible. I mean, it's just slightly disappointing as well, because that was Kat Shea who directed that. So another woman. And, we hadn't seen, I think, up until that point, only Pet Sematary had been a Stephen King adaptation that was directed by a woman, and I know that Carrie 2 isn't an adaptation, but inspired by a King story. And it just feels like a missed opportunity. It just feel like a generic teen movie with some kills added in. I mean, it's not without its points of enjoyment. I've watched it like more times than I should, and I do enjoy the bits where we go back we see Sue Snell, and we do a couple of flashbacks, which is always nice. I'm like, why am I watching this to watch a flashback of Carrie when I could just watch Carrie?
I know. I remember even back then watching those flashbacks of Carrie and being like, oh my god, let's just watch Carrie.
I know. But it has its fun moments, and actually her kind of her telekinetic outbursts at their house party then just pretty fun.
She goes kind of veiny, doesn't she?
Yeah, she knows her tattoo spreads like kind of barbed wire or something across her skin, and it's pretty naff. I put it on the kind of equivalent of I don't know why I always make this comparison, but in my head they occupy the same space. In Hellraiser 3, the kind of scene in the nightclub where the Cenobites come in and it's like all hell breaks loose, and the CD Cenobite is like flinging CDs, in this kind of like really naff thing. That's what the kind of house party sequence of Carrie 2 reminds me of.
It's true.
It's very of its time.
It's true. So I mean, I would usually end this by sort of asking you, how does the film hold up? And would you still recommend it? I mean, I'm guessing it holds up pretty well for you. I mean, actually, I remember when we talked, again, probably one of the first times we talked, and you were running a Stephen King season, right, at the BFI, in which you could see all of these films in NFT1 on a big screen. Was that for you the first time that you had watched Carrie on the big screen?
No, I've seen it quite a few times, actually. It pops up every now and then, and I always make sure I try and go.
Yes.
You can't beat seeing a nice scratchy old print of Carrie. Although I did have a really horrible experience where I saw it at not a horrible experience, but a screening of it at the ICA a few years back, which was an amazing screening because it was put on by the Final Girls, Anna Bogutskaya and Olivia Howe, who are the best, and they did a post-screening discussion, which I was lucky enough to be part of, and we talked about it, and it was a really great event, and they did a party afterwards, beautiful. They
did the prom
zine. It was really cool. But during the film itself, there was like just a small section of the audience that just kept laughing all the way through it, and I was like, guys, stop laughing, and it really upset me. I was like, they were like full belly laughing. It's
interesting, isn't it? Do you think that the movie is in any way supposed to be funny?
I think
because it is over the top.
Absolutely, I think you can find humour in there. Piper Laurie did, sort of satire, sort of black comedy. That's fine, but I don't know. There's something to be belly laughing. That's just disrespectful.
That is.
And Carrie has been through so much. You can at least afford her the honour of just sitting back.
I know.
It's
a really tricky thing, this, isn't it? I've spoken about this subject with a few people. This idea of we hosted for Halloween a Halloween screening of The Exorcist, and listeners of the podcast came to see it, and it was amazing. But also, a lot of people laughed through The Exorcist as well. When I had Mark Kermode on the podcast, I told him this. I was like, does it bother you? People laugh through that film, and he said, yeah, but it's almost like, I guess it's the same with Carrie. Some of these films are so now ingrained in pop culture and our own sort of subconscious almost, that we know these moments, they're so iconic that we then feel like we want to laugh at them or something. It's weird, isn't it?
I guess so. And there's also, I think there's something sometimes quite performative about people laughing in cinemas anyway, and laughing at horror movies. It's kind of, there's something performative about that act of doing that, and there's something about I think it comes from this idea of like being above something. And I think it's something we've talked about many times when we're talking about this, is people's disregard of horror and people's tendency to want to belittle horror and want to position themselves or other types of genres above it. And I think laughing at a film, at a horror movie, is a very conscious way to do that. It's like, I'm better than this. I can enjoy it, but it's below me. So I think there's a little bit, and that's why it annoys me, because it's like, I don't know who you think you are, but you are not above Brian De Palma.
I know.
Now get out of my cinema.
It's true. It's, watching a film like that with an audience, a film that's very personal to you, it's a very personal experience, isn't it? And that's why it's good to all be in lockdown and be watching films by ourselves.
Otherwise it's like they're all feel like they're laughing at me. They're all going to laugh at you.
They're all going to laugh at you, exactly. I love it. Well, there we go. Well, let me ask you, as a final question, Carrie aside, let me go back to the idea of body horror. What's your favourite? Do you have a favourite body horror?
It's so hard, like, what is a favourite? But I think the one that springs to mind is Society. Brian Usner's Society.
Which we may be talking about together.
I very much hope so. Yes. I love it so much. Never, ever stops being completely mind-blowingly insane.
Yeah, talk about another film that ramps up to quite a finale, right?
Yeah,
absolutely incredible.
And Brian Usner, one of the kind of, I guess, the saddest, most disappointing kind of career paths. I think Brian Usner should have been one of the we should talk about him as one of the horror greats. And it wasn't to be. But
he made his mark with that film.
I'm ripe for Usner reappraisal. So
yes, amazing.
If you want to chat Society, I'm there.
Amazing, I love it. To be continued then. Michael, thank you so much for this. Thank you for joining me.
The best hour and a half of my life. Literally.
Let's do it again.
Yeah, I'm hoping the recording went wrong, and you're going to be like, Michael, we've got to start again.
I have to talk from the top, from the beginning. Amazing. Where can people find? I mean, can people find anything going on out there in the world in terms of stuff that you're doing at the moment?
Yeah, we're kind of on hold at the moment. Usually, I do a monthly obviously TerraVision strand at BFI, so that's not happening for a little while. BFI South Bank's opening up again in September, but I'm not quite sure exactly what the plan is with public programs then. So kind of TBC. I think probably the next thing that I'll be kind of fully doing out there in a public space will be London Film Festival in October.
Amazing. Can't wait. Thank you very much.
Pleasure.
And that's it for this week. Thank you so much for listening, and a huge thank you to my brilliant guest, Michael Blyth. So, what did you think of this week's episode, and what do you think of this week's film, Brian De Palma's Carrie? Do you love it as much as Michael and I do? I would love to hear your thoughts. Please do get in touch. The email address is evolutionofhorror@gmail.com. Don't forget, you can also find us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Letterboxd. You can also chat about the podcast and horror films and anything you like with fellow listeners over on the discussion group. That's the Evolution of Horror discussion group, and that can be found on Facebook. You can also check out our new YouTube channel. That's where you can find a whole bunch of horror video content. Head on over to youtube.com/evolution of horror. You can find all previous episodes and seasons of our podcast on our website. Simply head over to evolutionofhorror.com. You can find this podcast on all major podcast platforms, including iTunes, Podbean, Acast, Stitcher, Libsyn, and Spotify. Subscribe to us, spread the word about us, tweet about us if you can, and if you get a minute and you haven't done so already, we would hugely appreciate a rating or review on Apple Podcasts, which helps us get discovered by new listeners. So, onwards to next week then for another one of my personal favourites. God, I'm loving this series so much. Next week, finally, for the very first time on the Evolution of Horror, we get to discuss a film by my favourite director in the world. Somebody who makes films that are so weird, so out there, they're almost impossible to classify. They're almost impossible to put into a subgenre or even a genre. But we are going to be covering a lot of his films over the next few weeks. Next week, I'm going to be joined by a brand new guest, Steph McKenna, and we are going to be talking about David Lynch's debut film, Eraserhead, from 1977. Oh Lord. Join us next week for all of this and more on the Evolution of Horror.